Hello, everyone. My name is Cassandra Klett, and I'm the Education Specialist here at the Key West Art and Historical Society. Thank you for joining us this evening for Tyler Gillespie's talk on his recently published book, The Thing About Florida, Exploring a Misunderstood State. So before we begin, at the top of your screen, as always, you'll notice that there is a donate button. If you can, please make a donation. Anything helps, and it continues to support the webinar software that we use, and also helps us continue to offer these talks at no cost. So the next thing you'll notice on your screen is a text box that will either be on the side or bottom, depending on what device you're using. If you have any questions during the talk, just go ahead and type your questions into those boxes and hit enter. And then at the end, we'll answer as many questions as time will allow for. All right, so today's distinguished speaker is a journalist, poet, and fifth-generation Floridian. He has written about Florida for GQ, The Guardian, The Nation, Vice, and Salon. He's the author of Florida Man, Poems, and co-editor of The Awkward Phase, The Uplifting Tales of Those Weird Kids You Went to School With. Welcome, Tyler, and thank you for joining us today.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. You can hear me? We're all good?
Everything's good.
Awesome. Well, I am very happy and honored to be here and considered a distinguished speaker. I'm very happy to spend this time with you. So for my presentation, I'm going to start by reading from my new book, and then I'm going to show some photos and some sounds from behind the scenes of writing the book. And then I'm going to read a little bit more, and then we'll do a short writing exercise together. And so what I'm going to be reading from the book, it was also recently published as an excerpt online. So I'm going to paste that in the chat if you want to read along, if that's helpful to you. So this was the first essay of the book that I started writing back in 2015. And it's about Florida Man, and the chapter is called Florida Man Theory. I have a theory that any true Floridian is less than 5 degrees of separation from a Florida Man story. A headline like Florida Man in pirate costume arrested for firing black powder guns. My theory rests on a Floridian knowing the neighbor's son. A Florida man learns hard way that he stole laxatives, not opioids. Since Florida Man can also be Florida woman, a Floridian might know a friend's cousin who went viral as Florida woman charged with stealing rental car says demons took it. In my case, a family member called the cops when a drug deal went wrong. Her dealer tried to rob her, and she wanted him to get arrested. I found the pre-viral Florida Man story in one local newspaper. The story happened in the early 2000s, so it's all but buried on the internet. In the mid-2000s, Fark.com, a website with the tagline, "We don't make the news, we mock it," began to track weird Florida news and contributed to the genesis of Florida as an internet meme. A major increase in searches for the term Florida Man later occurred in June 2012, around the time of the viral Miami cannibal story. A guy had reportedly smoked bath salts and chewed off the face of a homeless man who had passed out near a road. The cannibal story was shocking, fear-inducing, twisted, and sad. The victim went through a slow and difficult recovery. The story was also morbidly intriguing to some, and it became a primer for Florida Man, who has been described as a Yankee nightmare in human form, and everything frightening about white trash life in one meme. So I'm going to skip ahead. So basically what I do in the book is I look at some misconceptions of Florida or some different things that people might misunderstand. And then I give us kind of a present day moment. And then I try to add in some archival text and, back in the day. So I'm going to skip ahead to a section that kind of talks about Florida's past. Floridians have never exactly maintained a pristine reputation. We've behaved badly since statehood. Historians called antebellum Florida a rogue's paradise. Those Floridians like to carry weapons, and alcohol may have led to frontier violence. A penchant for alcohol and violence persisted and may have contributed to 1895's reported cutting affray. When Chaz stepped in front of Sam in line at the butcher shop, Sam's brother ran into the butcher shop to get a knife. He tried to stab Chaz. The scrum lasted until blood was seen, and the perpetrators fled to the woods to face later arrest. I could almost understand fighting over a long wait for a good piece of meat, but I couldn't get down with a turn-of-the-century man who killed his sweetheart. The story discussed a husband who asked his wife to stroll by sunlight through the meadow and green pastures. On this stroll, the wife apparently told him she could no longer be with him for all he is worth. 3 shots were fired. The paper made it seem like the husband killed his wife, but the jury held an inquest over the body, and the verdict was that the shooting was accidental. They let him go. Florida's papers weren't always filled with such violence. There were sections for fish news, poetry, potatoes, and the Alatra boosters, Edna May's recipe for being a successful wife to the ultra-rich. For those interested in bagging a sugar daddy, May's 1912 tips included spending time out in the country, focusing on vivacity, and living a simple life. I can't promise May's advice will translate to online dating success. During her time, Florida contained more alligators than people. Only about 500,000 folks lived in the state, a mostly untamed frontier. Businessmen and Chamber of Commerce members changed Florida's image. Developers dredged mangroves and salt marshes to make beaches. Trains brought people from up north. An 1896 advertisement for Tampa called the area a health and pleasure seekers' paradise, and a late 1800s article described its days as both invigorating and health restoring. The state marketed itself as a destination. The first 60 years of the 20th century saw Florida's population balloon by more than 900%. Transplants brought with them their own ideas of paradise, and they had plenty of space to do generally weird things. Generally weird Florida emerged as a new subgenre, in part because beach bum life coexisted alongside diverse flora and profitable fauna, like the reported wave of palm tree thefts in the mid-1990s. Former Tampa Bay Times editor Janet Keeler told me that generally weird headlines evolved into Florida Man because of journalism basics. The inverted pyramid put the most important information at the beginning of a news story, and for decades, journalists refrained from using everyday people's names in leads, the first sentence or two of stories. This meant stories often started with Florida man arrested for, or Florida woman arrested for. Ann Keeler said, without this construction, social media wouldn't have such a tidy way to collect the stories. These news headlines helped Florida man with a little m become Florida man, capital M. But the state's bad behavior may have stayed regionally confined, like, say, Idaho's or Nebraska's news, if not for our public records law. So I'm going to stop right there. And so for the rest of the chapter, I look into Florida's records law and I talk to some lawyers, and then I profile a woman who made headlines as Florida woman slapped grandmother over Facebook friend request. And I look into what actually happened, because that is not what happened. And so I then profile her, and her story went viral. It went to the BBC level. Nancy Grace talked about it. And so I talk about what really happened. And I think more importantly, I talk about what happened next, because oftentimes we just get these headlines about Florida and we don't hear what happened to the actual real people next. And for her, it was a moment where basically a week after her headline went viral, she ended up going to rehab. And so it's a story about her sobriety and her journey, and it's basically a story of redemption and hope. So that's kind of how that chapter plays out. And so a little bit about the book before I give the behind the scenes. So I'm just gonna briefly, there are 10 different chapters or essays in this book. I'm just gonna briefly discuss what they're about to kind of frame what I'm talking about with the presentation. So after the introduction is the Florida man theory, which I just read from, which I started writing with one of the first. Then I talk about hurricanes, because how can you not, living in Florida? I talk then about the Florida's role in the Civil War. I talk about crackers, Florida cowboys, because I got really interested in cattle after learning about Florida's role in the Civil War and learning about how important cattle was to that. Then I spend time with some 8- and 9- generation Floridian cowboys in Central Florida. And I love that. There's a cowboy romance story in there too, if you're interested in that kind of thing. And then I talk about the retirement community, specifically for aging members of the LGBTQ community and some of the problems that they face. Then I talk about alligators, because how can I not? Burmese pythons and the pet trade. And then I end with a personal story about growing up as a gay Christian in Florida and the history of creationism in the state. So that's context about what the chapters are about. And now I'm going to give a presentation about writing the chapters and just a little bit about my methods. So when I'm out in the field and interviewing people at a location, I will be recording what they're saying with a recorder. They know that I'm recording. Florida is a two-party consent state, meaning that they have to consent. Not all states are like that. I'll also be taking field notes and a journal or a notepad, and I'll take photos as well. And the reason why I take photos is because I'm not really super great with what people were wearing or those kind of details that I know readers really appreciate. I'm more interested in what they're doing, how they're standing, what they're saying. So I take photos so I can then go back and look at the photos to reference and write in those details. And I'm letting y'all know that because the photos I'm going to show you are not super professional quality. I didn't think I'd be showing people the photos, but I think they will help us to see the people that I'm talking about. And I'm also going to play short recordings of what they said to me during their interviews, so you all can hear them in their own words and what they sound like. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, and then we should be seeing this presentation. Yes, so the thing about Florida, Exploring a Misunderstood State by me, Tyler Gillespie. Okay. So to give a behind the scenes look at my writing process, I drew a few reference visuals and sound from 3 of the book's essays. So this one is from a confederacy of reenactors. So I was really interested in Florida's role in the Civil War because it's not something that I grew up learning about. The kind of history that I learned, as a 5th generation Floridian, the history that I mostly heard about Florida was the Fountain of Youth. And yes, I did take a trip there to St. Augustine and I drank from it. We'll see if that has any effects. But I got really interested in Florida's kind of like mytho-history, like the mythology about the state. And I got really interested in the Civil War. And I also was very interested in Civil War reenactors because at the time I was writing this in 2016, there were a lot of conversations about, the South and its monuments and these kind of portrayals. And I was really interested in why these people were doing these reenactments, what they thought about it, what they thought about Florida, all of these different things, because it's such a public kind of thing. And so one of the first people I talked to, okay, so I'm just going to read the first paragraph or version of the chapter. So on a Saturday morning in mid-January, 12 soldiers stand shoulder to shoulder in the Brooksville woods. Sunlight peeks around trees, dripping with Spanish moss. In the distance, shots fire. 5 women dressed in modern clothes, one in a Cookie Monster shirt, stand around a fire. Among them, a girl 9 or 10 talks about Harry Potter. They're cooking biscuits and gravy, but breakfast is running behind schedule. Near me, a toddler coos. Artillery members check their cannons. Lieutenant Colonel Keith Cole stands in front of his soldiers and yells order, 3/4, front, right. The 50-year-old watches his soldiers through round wire glasses reminiscent of John Lennon's frames. Cole has laughed easily and often throughout the morning, but he will die at 3:13 this afternoon, shot in the chest. And so here's a photo of Keith, and I am going to play a quick sound bite from him so we can hear him in his own words.
Today I'll be a lieutenant colonel portraying one of several battalions involved in the battle scenarios tonight.
And what is your camp or what is your group called?
It's the 1st Brigade Provisional Army of the Confederate States. there were two separate entities to the CS Army. There was the Army of the Confederate States. That would be the standing army when there was not a war going on. That would be the standing army that was there in peacetime. If a war came about like this one did, they would call up what they called the Provisional Army of the Confederate States, which was the men would be called up to meet a war. And when the war was over and the need was not there, that army would disband and go back to their civilian lives, and the Army of the Confederate States would remain standing. That was the peacetime army. Right there. First row over. Excuse me, good attention.
Yeah.
Hey! Gentlemen looking for you!
And what do you have in this tent? People keep going back in there.
The joys of command. I keep a couple of boxes in the back with basically loaner uniforms, loaner gear. Somebody's new getting into the hobby.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the least expensive hobby in the world.
Mm-hmm.
So as people are getting into it, rather than go drop all this big expense at one time, I don't shoot a musket anymore. I did enlisted man for years, so my muskets, I loan them to new guys as they get in. And I've got uniforms, leathers, accoutrements, canteens that it just gets loaned to people until they get the rope. Yeah, a lot of us are walking quartermaster departments.
Okay. So that's just a brief snippet of our interview, and I found that a really interesting moment because I became really interested in it and what they were wearing and how much these things can cost, you know, and how much they spend on what he called a hobby. Okay. Okay, and then I was introduced to Jenny Stracuzi, who is what they would call a progressive reenactor, which I became really interested in. Basically, she would only wear clothes, eat food, live the life that would have happened on the day that they were portraying. So they were very strict with the rules. And so she was a townsperson, and because, you know, women weren't fighting in the war often. And so she would, and other women would be in the town, and they would be doing things like, while the men were reenacting the war, they would be reenacting like sewing or playing croquet, I think they were doing, and writing letters and things like that. And I found this really, really interesting because Jeannie is, I can't remember she's like a 5th or 6th generation Floridian, and she basically based her character off someone in her family. And the way she did that was by looking at census records and different historical accounts. And what was also interesting is they were portraying, so this was the Brooksville Raid, which happened in Florida, but on that day, their town was not in Brooksville, it was in a different town, because they would do like different scenarios. And so they would research the women who would be living in these towns, but they couldn't find records because all the census records had been burned, burned in a fire. So they looked at the next town over. I just found it really interesting how much research that they did. She would make her own clothes. She did all of this research, and they would travel around to different events. So I just found that really interesting. And so this chapter was probably a little bit difficult for me to write, maybe the most, because folks were often very skeptical of what I was doing. You know, it's kind of, what was I writing? How was I going to portray them? And also, just kind of a little bit of background, I originally was thinking about participating with the reenactment and dressing out in a Confederate unit. I got the approval, but then I decided not to do that for various different reasons about what that could look like if that photo circulated. You know, I'm a teacher, different things like that, and the political moment. So there's just a lot of different things to look at and think about. So I spoke with Jeannie for a while, and then she invited me to the Reenactors Ball, which was a thing that they did after. And I want to just play a little bit of sound from that. Here's a photo, you know, with the callers calling out all these steps and all these things. Oops, I need to go back.
I've never done it. Would you? Thank you.
Alrighty, I'll be right here. So whatever happens in the tent stays in the tent. This is really good. Then you can write about it.
I don't know about that.
Okay, so I'm gonna just cut that a little bit short, so we can get on. It's basically, she invited me to dance, which I was not expecting, and then they're teaching me how to do the dances. So that is a scene in the book as well, and talking about that. Okay, so then I'm gonna go on to, I'm also sorry if people are asking questions or wanting to, I can't see if anyone's doing it, asking questions or, making comments, because I just see my screen. So I will get to those after. Okay, so then I'm gonna move on to this chapter called Reptile People. And so another headline that I had been seeing a lot of was about the invasive Burmese pythons in the Everglades in South Florida. And the headlines like, "The snake that's eating Florida," which is kind of connects to this fantastic, almost like scary wilderness of Florida. And I really wanted to know more about what was going on with the Everglades. So in one of the chapters, and before this, I go down to the Everglades and I don't participate, but I follow hunters who are participating in what was called the Great Python Challenge, the second one, where folks would go out into the Everglades and hunt these Burmese pythons, which are invasive and they are doing a lot of damage. And so I was, again, really interested in like who is doing this snake hunting. And what I try to do in the writing is talk to as many people as I can so we can see different angles. So for example, one group that I talked to was a group for veterans who they would just go and hunt these pythons as like a form of therapy to get out in nature. It's very, very hard to find a python. They're great. So they weren't necessarily out there to find pythons. They were out for community and to be out in nature. Then I talked to, like a blonde 20-year-old student who was out there. And so just kind of the different people who are hunting the pythons, but also how the snakes got there, because they're invasive, they're non-native. So how did they get there? What is the kind of damage they're doing, and what can be done about it? And so through that chapter, I talked to somebody who ended up being a pet smuggler, and then that led me into another chapter about pet smuggling and Florida's role in pet smuggling. And so through that, I met this person named Tom Crutchfield, who is a very notorious pet smuggler who has, in his older age, since retired and now breeds reptiles, a lot of iguanas, as we'll see. So this is kind of the beginning of that chapter. Former pet smuggler Tom Crutchfield told me if he didn't die during his monitor bite surgery, I could visit him in South Florida. He survived, so I drove to his compound and homestead. A friend said people moved to the area when they didn't want to be found. I pulled onto what I thought was Tom's property. A rooster crowed and Tom appeared. He greeted me with a handshake and some distrust. He wore a black Tommy Hilfiger t-shirt, shorts, and a Rolex. He looked sturdy, like Santa Claus with the sunburn. The surgery for the monitor bite turned his left pointer finger into a zombie appendage. There were too many stitches to count. And so here's a picture of his hand. I mean, I just, that's kind of how what I referenced. So a monitor is a very big lizard. It's, I think, the second biggest lizard. And basically what happened is there was two monitors that he has on his property were fighting. He got into there to break them up, which you shouldn't do if you don't have backup. And one of the monitors nearly bit his finger off and he had to have surgery. Okay, so then here are the iguanas that he breeds. So these you know, iguanas, we are very familiar with the green iguanas. These iguanas are obviously, they're not natural, and he'll tell us a little bit about these iguanas.
Yellow take much, but yellow and blue and green. So take yellow away, you have blue animals. It's a simple recessive trait like albino. That popped out breeding a het albino, red het albino to a green het albino has a black color to it. Every normal baby hatched out like that. It's a recessive, that's impossible. So that's a new kind of gene that you have in your body. The accidental. But those are worth a lot of money. Those, I mean, I've turned out 50 grand. I bet.
Okay, so as we can see, breeding these kind of iguanas can be very lucrative. And I had a really interesting moment while I was talking to this guy, and this I'm afraid of snakes and reptiles, which I write about in the book. I'm not a big fan of them at all. And I'm not very necessarily a fan of iguanas either. I've since come to respect reptiles in a different way from writing the book. But anyway, I had this moment where I was looking at these iguanas that you'll never see in nature. You know, they would be easy targets, and they're bred. And I had this moment where I was like, wow, I'm seeing something that I will never see again in real life, you know, that doesn't exist in nature. I'll never see this again. So that was a kind of an interesting moment. And then he also took me into, he has a lot of poisonous snakes, and they will milk the cobras. And they will milk, or not the cobras, the rattlesnakes for different, and they'll use the venom, and that can go into different products for like pain and different kind of medications. And I really wanted to give us a sound of, he showed me this sunset cobra and he was talking about it, and I had the audio for it, but then when I went back and listened to it, it just was it wouldn't be good for y'all to hear. But this was a really intense moment for me, someone who doesn't like snakes. But I digress. And this is the final chapter in the book, and it's called A Revelation. And I talk about growing up as a gay person in the Southern Baptist Church. I went to a Southern Baptist high school, and I connect that to kind of Florida's history with creationism. And as part of that, I talked to there was these street preachers who would go to Ybor City and stand in front of the gay clubs, and they were doing this for like 2 years every Friday. And so then a protest of college students came out, and so I talk about Florida, like colleges and stuff in Florida. And then so I'll just kind of read a little bit. So co-founder Aaron Muniz said about 6 or 8 people initially showed up with rainbow flags. Over the next few months, their group grew to 20, then 50, and sometimes more than 100 people came out on Fridays for the Wall of Love, which was their counter protest. And so I'm just gonna here's some photos of the street preachers. You know, if you've ever been to a gay pride, you've seen these folks out there. I was really interested in why they had been doing it for 2 years every Friday. What was their motivation? So I interviewed some of the street preachers, and then I also interviewed some of the protesters. Here's just another photo of the, you know, they're called street preachers. And then I'm gonna like listen to a 30 seconds.
We must love and support one another. We must love and support one another. We have nothing to lose but our shame. 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 It is our duty to fight for our freedom. It is our duty to fight for our freedom. It is our duty to win. It is our duty to win. We must love and support one another. We must love and support one another.
Okay, and so that is the end of those. And here's the book. And I can put a link into the chat if you would like to buy the book. Let me stop sharing now. Okay. Okay. Okay, so I should be back. I'm no longer sharing the screen. Let me drop a link. Oh, wait. Okay. Was y'all able to hear that? I hope you really were. I hope that we were able to hear all that and see all that. So I dropped a link in the chat for the book if you would like to purchase that. And so now what I want to do is read quickly another section of the book because I'm going to connect that to a short writing exercise that we can do together. Okay, so so of course, one of my favorite, I just, am afraid of reptiles and everything and don't really like lizards and all that. Oh, okay, I'm seeing some. Okay, yes, let me ask. Okay, so I see a couple questions. I will get to them in the end, even though that is a great question about the broke packaged cowboys. I will talk about that, even though I don't want to jump the gun with that. That's a great story, though. So I'm going to quickly read about alligators as it's connected to one of the writing things that I want to do. I couldn't write about Florida without writing about alligators. I was on a walk yesterday. I walk to the park, every other day, and they have alligators, and I was able to stand at the bridge and I saw a small alligator, and it was just sunning itself. It was so beautiful, and I just like communed with it. And then I was walking by some guy's house, and he came out to the dog, and he's like, "Did you see an alligator today?" And it was just like a moment where we were just bonding over alligators. It's exciting to see them when you're prepared to see them, not when they show up to your house or your pool, as they sometimes may do. Okay, so I'm going to read just a short section from this book. So when I'm talking about the alligators, I also talk about their role in Florida's economy, roadside attractions, alligator wrestling, different things like that, and how they're a symbol for Florida, but they've also been important to the economy. They're also important to the environment as a keystone species. And so this section connects to also to the Florida Man headlines because I found out about this person because she went viral with a headline about her alligator named Rambo. So this section is after I talk about the history or a history of alligator wrestling. In Mary Thorne's show, the Floridian had swum with 41 alligators in a Central Florida pit. She worked with the gators every day and knew which ones were the most aggressive. I had a gator that on command would show his privates, she said. Another I could pick up and kiss right on the mouth. Mary, in her mid-50s, reminded me of my great Aunt Annie, who used to feed her backyard gators. I admired these Florida women because they didn't take bull from anyone or any animal. Mary cared for her first gator as a little kid. Her brothers owned a fish hatchery and she fished gators out to play with her Barbie dolls. The mother of 7 never wrestled gators, but she did wrestle people. In a past life, she performed professionally under the name Biker Babe as part of the Triple X team. The great Malenko, who made a name for himself in championship wrestling, had trained her. Mary carried on the great Malenko's legacy after he died. She body slammed people for almost 40 years in the ring before she retired to perform with gators. I have been bitten twice by gators, she said, once in the head and once on the knee. Mary's job at the gator show led to the ownership of her first alligators. FWC staff members brought 5 little gators and an aquarium to her boss. He couldn't take care of them, so she decided to get her permit and take them home. The FWC said people could keep an American alligator for educational purposes, exhibition, or sale if they obtained the proper permits and license. There's a lot of people who own gators without their neighbors knowing, said Mary. They could be living next to you because in Florida, you can get a license to keep a gator inside and do education with it. License applicants had to demonstrate 1 year and 1,000 hours of substantial practical experience with the care of alligators or other crocodilian species. Mary's gators, named Rambo, Oscar, and Alyssa, had been poached as hatchlings and kept in a dark closet for years. They had little room to move in the small aquarium. Mary said they'd been in the dark for so long their immune system was shot. The gators couldn't function properly, so Mary began to give them physical therapy. She soon found out the extent of damage done by the darkness. They couldn't take the sun. I had one sitting by the window, she said, and the filtered light through the window actually killed the gator. I asked Dr. Laura Brandt, senior wildlife biologist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, about the possibility of sun-sensitive gators. She said, perhaps they would have sun sensitivity initially, like you would have if you were kept in the dark. Mary realized the gator's sun sensitivity. She thought, if humans can do sunscreen, then gators can too. That's how her gators ended up wearing clothes. She lathered them in sunscreen and dressed them in biker gear and a Santa outfit for Christmas. Somehow, she didn't lose a finger in the process. Mary's permits allowed her to keep alligators until they reached 6 feet in length. She did not live on the required acres of land needed to keep bigger gators. Mary planned to rehab the gators and then take them to a facility like Gatorland in Orlando. Mary did this for all but Rambo. She didn't want to drop him off at one of the professional facilities because of his sun sensitivity. She feared his weakened immune system would get him eaten by other gators. FWC told her she had to find Rambo a new home because of his size. As Rambo inched towards 6 feet, she found it difficult to part with him. Her son died during her battle for Rambo, and she became even more attached to the gator she had raised. I decided I wasn't going to get rid of Rambo, she said. They were going to have to shoot me before I got rid of him. So then I kind of talk more about Mary and Rambo, who lives in her house, and the headlines and kind of what happened next with that. And so to kind of end the reading, this chapter goes to Gatorland, which she talks about. So that's kind of how I try to structure the chapters and the sections. If someone mentions something in one section, I try to link that in the next for the narrative. So then I spend some time at Gatorland, and then I connect it back to alligator wrestling, which I had talked about the history earlier in this book. So I'm at Gatorland. I watched 2 of these wrestlers perform in a rodeo-type pit surrounded by a moat of water. The alligator show looked like a bigger budget version of the ones I'd already seen. Performance value inched toward Disney quality. One of the audience members near me asked her friend if the alligators were animatronic. The area's theme parks seemed to make people question reality. Florida, in general, has a way of doing that. The gators were definitely not animatronic. They were real. Very real. I found this out firsthand after the show. Tim had told me earlier he'd have me sitting on a gator by the end of the day, and the end of the day approached. He convinced me to wait in line to sit on the wrestled gator's back. Tim wanted me to pose with it, most likely a nuisance gator spared from harvest by Gatorland. I didn't want to crawl on the back of this gator. It probably wished for sleep instead of getting the paparazzi treatment. As my turn neared, I unexpectedly felt the urge to experience a fleeting moment as an alligator wrestler. Those Floridians understood these animals in ways I never would. I also felt peer pressured by a circle of kids who casually took their photos with the animal. Their carefree giggles mocked me. I couldn't let them win, so I knelt in the sand. The gator's mouth had been taped. I placed my hand under its jaw. I felt the softness. The head, in comparison, was rough. A shot of adrenaline rushed through my body. A lot in Orlando ran on an electrical impulse, but this gator ran on something different, a heartbeat. The gator's heart wasn't 3-chambered like other reptiles. The big lizard had a 4-chambered heart like mammals or birds, a long-lost dinosaur cousin. I rubbed my hand across the gator's head and felt grateful for it. These ancient gators contained Florida's history and the story of its land. They linked us to Florida's wildness, a wildness we should never forget. Okay. So that's where I'm going to stop with reading about alligators and other animals. So now what I want us to do is, what I like to do, since we are unfortunately not able to be in a physical space together, I want us to do a writing exercise so we can use our bodies together and do something together. And we'll only do this for 2 minutes, and you do not have to share this writing. It's just for you and your memory and something to take away from my discussion. But if you would like to share this, you can put this in the chat. And so I will time us, and the prompt is what, and I'll write this in the chat. Okay. So I think you should be able to see that in the public. It's the writing prompt is, what is an animal that makes you think most of Florida or that represents the state to you? And we will do this for 2 minutes, and I will be writing along with you. Okay, our 2 minutes is starting now. Okay, so I see that some people shared. I really appreciate that. I just had a memory that I hadn't thought about. That I used to, like, for the longest time, these 3 lizards would come to my window every single night, and they would eat bugs and fight each other. And I would see them every single night. And then I haven't seen them lately. And so now I'm kind of sad, like, where did they go? I hadn't thought about them in a while. And so thank you for writing with me and for thinking about the animals in Florida with me. And so I think now I am kind of done with my presentation. If we would like to, open it up for questions. Rosetta spoonbills. Yes, they are beautiful and graceful, but must fight hard for survival as humans encroach upon their habitat and water quality suffers. Many people want to live in or visit in Florida, but we need to be wary of our impacts. Whoever wrote this, I cannot see the name, but I 100% agree with that. And I also see the Florida scrub jay, which the University Press of Florida, which published my book, also recently just published a new book, I think in April in the same month, on the scrub jay, written by Mark Walters, which the scrub jay has a fascinating and important history in Florida. So that might be a good book for anyone who's interested in that to check out. Okay. Gator, of course, and sadly, pythons. Okay. So one question that I see here, is there a uniquely LGBTQ view of Florida history? And then could you talk more about the Brokeback-ish cowboys? So I'll start with the cowboys who were, so that was a straight couple, not Brokeback cowboys, though that would be amazing story for me to include. I did not find that, but I found a story about this couple, and what I really enjoyed about it was that she wasn't a cattle person, and she came to fall in love with this guy who was this longtime cowboy, and she started working with cattle, and she offers this perspective. So part of that chapter is about homegrown, family-owned ag companies, or specifically cattle. So a lot of it is, we hear about these industrialized farming, which is, of course, what we think about the impact and how bad that is. And then so I wanted to think about the Floridians and who had these smaller operations and their connection to the land. And so anyway, she had not ever lived on a cattle farm. And so she was able to offer this perspective that I think was really interesting and important, that when she first moved, she used to nurse the cows and the cattle, and she became very attached to them. So she discusses like her emotional connection to the animals, and how it's really hard not to have an emotional connection to the cattle, because they raise them for at least a couple years before they're shipped off, and sometimes they have to nurse them and things like that. So that offered a really interesting perspective. And also she's a Florida cattle woman, and she saw her husband almost die when he got bucked off by a horse because of he called it a what did he say, a hairy Mary, or a scary Mary heifer had hit his horse and got bucked off. And anyway, she saw that happen, and he was able to recover. But it's just a really interesting, and I think very cute love story that I really appreciate. And so the uniquely LGBT view of Florida history, yes. So I'm currently working on, so yes, that's true. And I'm also currently working on a book about different communities and LGBTQ communities in Florida. A manuscript, let's not call it a book, who knows. So if that piques anyone's interest, and anybody is interested in talking to me about that offline, if they have any of that kind of history they want to talk to me about, please feel free to email me. But yes, there are. And what I write about in the book is specifically the issues facing the LGBTQ community in terms of retiring and aging. The chapter is called Young and Beautiful Forever. And specifically, Florida is known as this retirement community, or retirement state. A lot of folks retire, but a lot of the times LGBTQ members face different issues because they either don't have children, or what I found through talking to a bunch of folks is the networks they have been very much altered by the AIDS epidemic, and how that impacted community bonds and what it's like to get to age. And so now folks I talked to said a lot of folks are even going back into the closet as they get older for health issues and to their doctors and stuff like that. So thinking about ways for sustainable aging and different things. I talked to people who are interested in retirement communities and what that could look like, thinking about the future. And what he says is that, or what they say is that, aging isn't something that people talk about until they are at that stage in their life. And it's something that we need to be talking more about and thinking about. It's about the different specific struggles that gay people have, but it's not just related to the LGBTQ community. Obviously, the economy and the way people's money is changing. So we need to think about that. And something that's important to me, because I grew, I'm currently living with my grandmother. We quarantined together, and it's something that's been on my mind a lot. But there are different histories in Florida, specifically which I won't get too much into in other questions, but specifically Florida has like with the creationist movement, which I didn't really even know was that prevalent in Florida. There are different like pockets of that kind of history, like the Johns Committee, if anyone's familiar with that, which is basically, you know, kind of like a witch hunt for gay people in university. Do you know the name of the Scrub J book? Yes, I will put the link in here just for anyone that is interested into that. Okay. Is your book available on other platforms? Do you prefer one to buy it through the link? Oh, thank you so much. Yes, the book is available through that link. It's good to support small press or to support university presses. It's also available at different bookstores, or you know, a lot of different Florida bookstores have supported it, which I really am thankful for. And so since we are talking to the, I don't know if a lot of folks are very familiar with the University Press of Florida, but I'm just going to drop a link into them, and you can see the book is called Florida Scrub Jay, Field Notes on a Vanishing Bird. I think I'll just drop a link to it's a university press, so they do a lot about history, of course, and it's they have a lot of great titles that maybe folks in here will be interested in. Okay. So moderated, alligators make me think of Florida because I saw a lot of them bunched together, lazily sunning on a bank in the Everglades. When I trained in Orlando for my job, I would take time to go ride a bicycle on a break to see if I could find any lurking near the water. I know, it never gets old seeing one. They're just, like I said though, unless it's in your pool, you don't want that. But I mean, you know, if you know to expect them, it's just like, I love them. Okay, I'm trying to make sure. Okay. 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 Thank y'all so much for sharing your writing with me. Oh, University Press presently has a sale. Yes. Thank you, Karen, for mentioning that. They have some kind of sale going on. Yes, oh yeah, code spring SPR21. Okay, thank you so much for sharing all your writing, Rosetta Spoonbill. I'm trying to make sure that I've seen all the questions. I know we are kind of, the time is kind of coming to an end. Does anyone else have any questions or anything that they would like to say? Yes, I see someone in the chat mention Carl Hyacins. I think Squeeze Me is a new book, the newest book, unless, you know, he has a more recent one. Yeah, there's a lot of great Florida. I mean, there's a lot of great Florida writers writing fiction, nonfiction, everything. That's something that's super great about the state is there's a lot of stories, and I feel like, you know, we all have different perspectives, and so that's what I try to write. What I write about in the book is there are many different ideas of Florida and a lot of different Floridas. So I present my kind of version of Florida, things that I'm interested in or misconceptions that I've heard about the state and things that I think are important. But no two writers will ever write about, you know, Florida in the same way, which I think is fascinating. The state is endlessly fascinating, especially for people with the history buffs. Yes, Lauren Groff short story novel. She has a short story collection called Florida. I also, since we've been talking about books, another book that I really like that is connected to the history of the state and the animals is Craig Pittman's book. It's called Cattail, and it is about the Florida panther, which has a very interesting and important history to it. So that's another book that I recommend that's connected to like history and animals. How has living in Florida, a renegade state, in so many ways determined your experience? With former POTUS living there, do you feel liberated that he was voted out? So Florida, so many ways. So that's a really interesting question and kind of framed why I write the book. So in the opening chapter, I talk about all the jokes that I've heard about Florida. I didn't really realize Florida was a strange kind of place until I was, kind of more of an adult, and especially when I moved to Chicago after my undergrad, and everybody would ask me about what's wild is happening in Florida now, Florida man, all of these things. And so I didn't really start to realize that it was even that widespread until then I moved to New Orleans for graduate school, and I was sitting in a bar with the new students and a Texan, who Texas has its own interesting, history, and in New Orleans was like, what is up with Florida? And at that moment, I was like, there has to be something here if a Texan in New Orleans is asking me what's up with Florida. But I think what it really circles back to, and why people have said that the book is good for people who are interested in Florida, but maybe who are not, because it's really reconciling with our perceptions of home. Because I feel like no matter where people were born, oftentimes they don't really love it, or they feel a kind of way about it because we want to escape and go to the big city if we were born in the country or whatever. And when I was talking about this, someone was like, yeah, my daughters were born in Manhattan and they now hate Manhattan. And I'm like, I would have given like anything to have been living in Manhattan. But now I really appreciate growing up in Florida because it's a beautiful place. I mean, of course, but it's also got so much important history and interesting environmental aspects. And I think it also has, I don't want to say that it's necessarily contributed to my sense of empathy, but I think that in a way that it has, because like I write about in the Florida Man chapter, I've known, people who could have gone viral for their stuff and having that for their lowest moments. And so having that, living here and then reconciling with that, I really try to think about like, okay, well, that was someone's lowest moment, but what happened next? And try to just know that people are complicated and hopefully they can be, redeemed. So yeah, that's kind of my answer to that. And what the interesting thing about the Donald Trump question too is, so I pitched a story in 2016 about the I-4 corridor between Orlando and Tampa. There's like a really big voting block, and I was really interested in the young Republicans because I was like, I think this is a big national story. Florida is of course a hugely important state when it comes to elections, and we've had our kind of snafus with elections anyway. I thought it was a really important story, and turns out I was writing for a couple publications and they all rejected the story because they said it wasn't a national story. But come to find out, of course, it was. We can link it back now to the young Republicans and different things in Florida. It really did affect the outcome, and I bring that up to say that a lot of these national issues and stories that we look at have Florida connections, for better or for worse, I would say. But sometimes we can trace a lot of these stories back to Florida. And so I know our time is running out, and I really thank you for those questions and spending time with me and sharing your writing. I really appreciate that. I'm very, like I said, very honored to be speaking with you. And thank you for having me. I really appreciate that. And again, if you want to reach out to me, I will put my email in here. I'm very easy to find online, so I don't mind sharing my email address. If you have any further questions or want to talk to me about, gay Florida history, which is the queer Florida history, which is what I'm kind of currently working on.
All right, so we'll give a couple more moments if there are any other questions, but thank you everyone for joining us today. And thank you so much, Tyler. This is, like, I also grew up in Florida, so there, of course, are so many crazy things. And again, like, you don't realize that it's not unnormal to see a gator in your pool or a snake or whatever. Like, it's normal to go fish these things out before you jump in. So it's definitely an interesting place to grow up, say for sure. So our next virtual event is going to be our Happy Hour with Historian. That's going to take place next Wednesday, May 19th. So if you haven't already signed up for that, just visit our website. Go to the events tab, scroll all the way down to the bottom, and our curator, Corey, is going to be talking